So, everyone, welcome to SciFi In The Sky. This is a pre-record, so if you're watching it on the Twitch stream and you want to ask questions, unfortunately, you have to travel back in time to Monday, where this will all be happening. So, thank you for your patience as well, because it is the magic of Zoom. Does that make us all Zoomers? I don't know. But yes, hello. Could everyone introduce themselves, please?
Starting with who?
Do we
I'm
really
just
start
screaming. Are you just screaming at us, Carol?
Sorry, mate.
No, she's gone.
Okay. Well, RJ, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'm RJ Barker. Welcome to my house. I'm the author of the Wounded Kingdom trilogy, which are fantasy murder mysteries, and they're Age of Assassins, Blood of Assassins, and King of Assassins. And then this is my new book, The Bone Ships, which, oh look, have I got it upside down? No, the product placement. And we can just read Brilliant by Robin Hobb and never writing again. And I write stuff and talk nonsense, and I don't know, that's me. And I've got big hair.
Adrian?
Hello, I'm Adrian Tchaivosky. I am, I guess, best known for writing sci-fi books about spiders. I've got here my book out next month, which is appearing in my camera completely backwards. Firewalkers, which is about the world going horribly wrong, but not in the way it currently is in the real world.
Katie, we have you unmuted now. Hello, are you okay?
Yeah, sorry, it's not I don't have a webcam, so it's somebody else's computer. So
Okay. So, do you want to tell us about your book?
yes, I write. Currently, I'm writing. Currently, I'm writing a novella for somebody else's world. Literally 5 minutes ago. But I also write kind of comic, grimdark, sword and sorcery series of books, as well as ghostwriting for other people and things.
And you've got From Hell's Hearts just come out, if memory serves.
I do, yes. It came out last week on International Unicorn Day, which I thought was rather special. But yeah, it's kind of like, it was really good that it came out, but kind of a little flat champagne, given the situation we're living in. So.
And Matt, hello.
Hello, I'm Matthew Ward. I'm kind of the newbie of the group. My debut, Legacy of Ash, came out in paperback just last week. But previous to that, I worked for Games Workshop, working on their Warhammer 40,000 IPs. So not as much of a flashy intro, not as much behind me, but Legacy of Ash. There we go.
Matt has the most swashbuckly beard moustache combo. I would trust him as a musketeer. Then Adrian, then Katie, because I know she's dangerous with a sword, and then Ed.
Filters, it's not real.
Yeah, and then lastly me, who shouldn't be allowed anything so sharp, really.
Your wit, RJ.
Yeah, it won't serve you if someone's coming out with a sword, though, will it?
But it'll make them feel really bad about it once they kill you.
I'll die, but you'll feel small for 5 minutes.
So, just to kind of get into it, and before we go into the actual topic, which is about fantasy world building, but a fun question that I love to write authors books out. I love to ask authors who have got books out is, how would you describe your current book to the Queen of England, obviously, rather than Freddie Mercury?
Well, if we're talking Firewalkers, I'd say it's about horrible rich people getting their just desserts, so you probably wouldn't like it, Your Majesty.
I think you just handily done my one as well there, Adrian, so you saved me a job.
I'd say it's about Lady Nelson, Mom, and you love it, and she will never read it, but I think because I mentioned Nelson, I think she'd feel honor bound as a queen to go, it's lovely, And then I'd have by royal assent on my books, which as someone who doesn't believe in the royals is a bit hypocritical, but it's a very nice crest. So and HP Source has it, and if it's good enough for them, good enough for my books. So yeah, Lady Nelson, absolute lies. No, I'd go further than that. I'd say it's about magical corgis. That's what I'd say. Have I vanished?
No, you're still there.
All right, I've vanished from mine.
What would your royal pitch be?
For me, sorry.
Yes.
My royal pitch, Your Majesty, I'm a huge fan. All lies, obviously. What would I say? It's about love and vengeance with fart jokes and things. Yeah, that's probably encapsulated it. Really, I think she'd get that. I think she'd understand a good fart joke.
Would you curtsy? I would, just to confuse her.
Ooh, I don't know. I might bow.
Yeah. See, she would not know which way to go with us. She'd be like, it upset her. She'd be discombobulated by the time she got down to Adrian.
So, getting on to the actual topic, as writers and authors and creators, the kind of, when we build a fantasy world, what is the first thing that you do? There's the running gag, of course, that Tolkien decided that the first thing he was going to do was reinvent language and then build his world up from there. Most of us can't be asked of that sort of thing. So what is the first thing that you do when you set out to create a new fantasy world?
I don't know if you can hear me, but I bet we've lost everyone.
I can hear you, Adrian, but you can't hear me saying that.
I can hear you.
Your picture's frozen, but you're definitely audible.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Oh, he's gone.
Oh, he's gone. Bye. He'll come back, I'm sure.
Yes, you should do.
He's not that far from me. I could go and sit outside his house and.
You could have done this together, actually, really, couldn't you?
Yeah, but no. He could have sat in his house, and I could have sat in his garden with my computer like that, and he could have sat in the mirror.
Of course, I forgot. I keep forgetting because this is like normal life for me. So
it's not for me because there's people in my house,
and
I don't like it. And apparently, I'm married to one of them, and the other one is my child. But they're here a lot.
Oh, yeah, that could be quite weird.
Yeah, it's quite upsetting.
Yeah.
They keep talking to me. It's terrible.
How's the homeschooling going?
How's the
homeschooling going?
Homeschooling is going really, really well because my little boy is actually more enthusiastic than I am. He's written himself a timetable, and I just have to leave him to it, and he's off.
Brilliant.
And he comes over and asks me questions about maths that I cannot answer. And I think we got Adrian back.
Yay!
So getting on to the actual, we went on a tangent because of course we did. Because what happens when you've got a bunch of fantasy authors in one room is they talk about anything but books.
We were waiting.
You just got nobbled by the Queen.
Yeah. Is it not that one where we talk about anything but the topic?
That's Brave New Words, which you can listen to on iTunes.
Lovely, smooth. It's RJ Barker's Brave New Words, actually.
I believe it is when you're on there, definitely.
Yeah.
So yes, if someone would like to start, where do you start with building a fantasy world?
I start with deciding whose book I want to rip off, and then I go from there. Really, I don't really think I don't think like that. I kind of have an idea that appears in my head, almost fully formed, and then I think I'm going to write that. Like with Age of Assassins, I thought I wanted to write Agatha Christie in a fantasy world, which is kind of what it is if Miss Marple was a 15-year-old part psychopath. She is a psychopath, though, is Miss Marple. Don't get me wrong, she's a dangerous woman. And the Bone Ships, I dearly love Hornblower and Patrick O'Brien and that sort of big naval setting. And I wanted to write something like that, but I didn't want to have to learn too much about ships because it's very, very complicated. So I decided I would invent them from scratch for that world. Mistake, don't do it. It makes things much harder than I thought. And also, I kind of take the real world and throw in one thing that makes a mess of it, and then all my logic just follows from there. So it was, what if you had massive ships, but you didn't have any wood to build them out of? What would you use? And from there I got to bones, and obviously you need something really big, so we had really big sea monsters. But I knew if I told my editor there were dragons, she would go for it because she loves dragons. So that was the world set up then. And I knew I wanted to do a matriarchal world because it would annoy people that were annoyed by that sort of thing, which just pleases me inside.
Matt?
I'm probably the other end of the spectrum, actually, because so Aradane, which is the world of Legacy of Ash, I've been building on and building into for about 20 odd years now in one form or another. And so I do have weird things, like I do have bits of language, I do have bits of map. The map has survived incredibly well, actually, in the transition over the years. But I like to think about, I'm very much a sort of Tolkien-based traditionalist. I like to think about things as being history being the result of language and language being the result of history. So it's all those little bits and pieces come together. So how, if you've got gods like you do in Aradane, even though they're not hugely present in Legacy of Ash, it's about how their existence has shaped the civilizations and the cultures that work around them. And that comes through in the language, it comes through in the beats of history, and it comes through in how they interact with other things as well, sort of technology and bits and pieces like that. So it's, yes, it's weird. See, I'm wittering already. That's not a good sign. But yeah, I love the details. When I think about something, I think about what does this spin off out into, and then that feeds into something else and something else and something else, and then get right. How much of that actually fits in the book, and how much I just keep in my head and hope there's room for it later. We're on about an 80-20 at the moment.
I do think that thinking a lot about a thing is very close to cheating, really.
Well, it's the closest I come to doing any actual work, so yeah. I've got to do it somewhere.
All right, then, let you off.
And my process starts quite similarly to RJ's. You have your big idea, and usually with me, it's what if this one fantastical thing was basically commonplace. So with the Tiger and the Wolf series, Echoes of the Fall, it's, well, what if everyone's a shape changer, and that's just your basic norm? And then it's like I build the world from that in the similar way to chucking a rock into the middle of a pond, and then you see where the ripples go.
Yeah,
because that changes that, and then that means that they wouldn't have to do these, and they'd have how does that affect the sort of societies? How does that affect your beliefs? How does that affect absolutely everything? I'm a lot more interested, I think, in this sort of world where you've got the strange thing that is normal to them, rather than a world which is sort of very similar to a historical period, except that there is a hidden strange thing, like, oh well, there is magic, but it still means that there is a Catholic Church and a very European style setup and kings and castles, and because the magic is very hidden and very secret, everything can kind of continue. Because you think, if there was actually magic and it could demonstrably do the things it can do, things shouldn't be the same. Things should change right from the get-go. You shouldn't necessarily, you wouldn't have your Roman Empire, you wouldn't have your sort of recognizably Christian church, or your ethnic groups, or all of the other things you do see in fantasy, if you've got something that is that different.
Gosh, Katie?
Honestly, it's not something I think about before I start writing a story. Usually the characters come and the concept. So it's like, what if this was a thing, or this is something I'd like to explore, like race and gender or something like this. And it starts with the character, and then it starts really small, very intimately, and things tend to spread out from there. And then I do what all children do when you've got your bucket of toys that smells vaguely of old Play-Doh. I kind of like ram everything together. So like, oh yeah, a bit of Roman. Oh, I like a bit of Roman. And then I'll take a bit of ancient Egyptian, and then, oh, wouldn't it be funny if that happened? And then it's like, oh, and I've just got this mess sticking, bits of chewing gum and dog hair stuck to it. And it's like, ooh. So then I have to try and rationalize it, obviously, because the internal logic, if it's not right, I get a bit weirdly twitchy. It's like, oh, that wouldn't work because of that, and that would never happen. So then I have to get all AD&D on its ass and sort it out and make, because I used to game a lot, tabletop game, I still do, and write a lot of games. We're always inventing our own games. It was always about internal logic and how many miles to so-and-so. And I am very boring about that. But the concept comes first, the character, everything evolves, everything gets really messy. And then I sort of make it all more organized. And now the series of books I'm writing now, there are 4 books in the series. And it's this world has sort of evolved with the story, but it's got an internal logic, it's got a rationale, and things work. But I still keep, if I see anything, I'm like a bit of a magpie. If I see anything cool, it gets put, and you can rationalize anything. This is world building. It makes me smile because you can, if you think about it, rationalize anything, but you have to rationalize it. If there are inconsistencies, it really kind of like tweaks my awkward bone. I won't say OCD because I'm not a diagnosed OCD person, but it just bugs me if internal logic doesn't quite match up. So I do things ass about face, basically, Ed.
So I think one of the things that many fantasy writers are, to some extent, are gamers. They enter fantasy through different ways. And what we're starting to see now is we're starting to see the rise of fantasy source books. You could argue that Silmarillion is one. A lot of fantasy books have maps in the front, and it's this whole kind of pre-built world building. Why do worlds need stories? Can we not just have a nice atlas, some nice drawings, and an understanding of the gross domestic product of that city?
Ed, I'm going to throw my book at you with its beautiful map in the front by Tom Parker, which is lovely. No, because that's just a pretty thing to put on your wall. And what makes me interested in a book is the people in it and the stories. And I don't really care about how complicated your world is, or what your world is. Or that doesn't bother me. I want to know stories, and I want to lock in with those people, and that's why I'm not really. I don't sit and build a world. I tell a story about people, and I make the world fit the story I want to tell. And the annoying thing with that is by the time you get to the end of the book, when you've set that up and you have to write it all down, remember it, which is quite tiresome, to be honest with you, because that's rules and I don't like it. But I'm not from gaming or D&D or that. I've never done any of that. It's never been part of my life. My reading is mostly crime and science fiction, and I've kind of not quite sure how I ended up a fantasy writer, but I love doing it. I'm not really interested in fantasy worlds, and I think the nearer they get to the thing that really grabs me, that absolutely grabs hold of me, is things that are so big I could never have imagined them. I'm going to use Adrian's Children of Time and Children of Ruin, which just knocked me out of the park completely. Just the breadth of imagination and the way he made things, inhuman things, feel very realistic to me is everything to me that is important in writing books and telling stories. That matters. Everything else is dressing for those things to me, because you've got to stress that to people, that none of us know the answers, and the answer for every person is completely different. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm slipping.
So right. As always, just chip in.
Yeah.
So we're talking about why not just write a source book?
I have a sneaking suspicion that there's a big part of me which will be quite happy to just write the world. I mean, I still at some point want to do that kind of slice of life novel like say Becky Chambers does so well, where basically it's just people. There is no grand overarching plot. There's no Dark Lord. It's not about doing the big thing. It's just a book about people living in a completely different world, getting on with their lives. But because the world is different, their lives are very different as well. And just writing that, a book that's almost just a collection of interlinked vignettes of people scrabbling about for a living in a fantasy world or a science fiction setting. But then, I mean, Children of Time was mostly just a thought experiment about evolution that happened to have a plot sort of added to it. But the thought experiment very much came first.
Yeah, the spiders, though, are so engaging to the point that really I'm kind of reading through it thinking, bored of the people now, back to the spiders, come on. I would just read an entire spider novel, and this is just going to be me fanboying Adrian for the rest of it. I'm sorry, you just have to listen. Sorry.
I was going to add, actually, I would say that Spiderlight is almost the anti-Becky Chambers, in the sense that we have this. Spiderlight is a great novel, fantasy, take apart of fantasy, but it's almost the opposite in the way that we focus on the kind of the minutiae, and also it has a Dark Lord in it.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate I've been kind of hogging the mic a bit, but Spiderlight actually, it's a bit of another thought experiment because it came out of a book I read called Dungeons and Dragons in Philosophy, which basically considered a variety of philosophical conundrums through the lens of the sort of alignment and other conventions brought up in role-playing games. It was a fascinating book. But it basically then said, well, what if you did have a world where alignment, and you could go up to someone and detect whether they were evil or not, and what does that mean? And then Spiderlight kind of grew out of that.
And now I want to know what challenge rating Kant would be. Matt, world building.
So the source book thing. So I think it's odd because a source book that's just a map and names on a map, it's just letters on a map. Those names don't actually have any context inherent to themselves. Without the stories behind them, they don't matter. So I'm not even sure why you would do that in the first place. Because I think one of the things that's quite hard, I think, was the thing I always struggle to connect with the Silmarillion particularly, is I don't really get a sense of any of the characters at play beyond the broadest brushstrokes. The elves are incredibly arrogant. Morgoth is evil. And there are some other things as well. And some of that's my flaws as a reader, but the map is fascinating in that because it then ties back into their stories and gives context to them. And then that then mirrors back out into the map. And I think they're different tools for telling the same kind of stories, but you need both because otherwise it isn't really a world. It really is just letters that have been arranged in an order that no one has ever done before. And that's particularly true, I think, when you look at a lot of fantasy maps from certainly sort of 20, 30 years ago, where you can see people scratching at that warm fuzzy glow that some of the classic maps, not just the ones from Lord of the Rings, but things like Shannara and all those things that are the building block of the fantasy genre that we have today. And they haven't quite got it because they've got all the names, they've got the coastlines, all the bits and pieces are there, but because it's all dry, there's nothing there, there's no character to connect with, there's no history that you care about. You've got no reason to care if people live there or what they're doing or what they're trying to fight against, because that's missing from the context. Does that make sense? I'm sorry, I'm definitely wittering today.
No, it's fine. We're here for the witter.
Dangerous.
Come for the witter, stay for the beer.
If it was an actual convention, it'd be a bar and we could point people at it. Unfortunately, go to your fridge, I suppose.
Yeah, my fridge is back there. It's in the kitchen, which is awful and messy. And I haven't got Tango, but it's full fat, so I'm playing with.
It's not vodka and orange then.
I'll say it is. It's a lie. No, it is.
No, go on. No, I was just going I don't actually like maps in books. The first book I wrote, I didn't even want a map. I did very little world building. It was all about the characters. It was a pseudo medieval setting because I mean it worked, but I was way more interested in the characters. Maps in books don't really interest me, but what does interest me about atlases and stuff is you're reading about, you know, Hangman's Drop or Widow's Avenue or something like that when you're looking at street maps, and then that gets the thought processes going. And I've always been fascinated by looking at maps and looking at globes and this kind of thing, but I'm not actually very keen on them in books, but apparently you've got to have a map in a book, so I've got maps in my books.
I'd like to make a defense of maps in book. I mean, it's one of the, it is a very divisive issue for writers and readers both. And I mean, I do think of there was certainly a period where the maps and books all seemed to be generated by the same map making program, and they were very dry and antiseptic and not at all atmospheric. I mean, if you've got a beautiful hand-drawn map like the ones that Tom makes for RJ, for example, that can actually be a very nice, just visual introduction to the world, because the map, the style of the map is backing up the feel of the story, but also with the kind of the world first idea. And I mean, I always try and convey a living world. I always try and convey a world that is bigger than the events that the story will cover, because that's, to me, how worlds work. And if you have a story where by the end of the book, everywhere has been completely bottomed out and there is literally nowhere on that map that you haven't visited, then that, aside from being geographically highly unlikely, you kind of feel that that world doesn't feel real if there's nowhere else to go. And one of the things a map can do is it's a pure visual reference, so that you can have the characters who live in the world and don't need to say, yes, let us go to this city, which of course is 10 miles north of this other landmark, because the map effectively is providing you with the context and the knowledge that the characters already have. So if you ever get confused as to where the hell am I going, you can just, oh yeah, that's there and that's there, and I'm now kind of on the same level as the characters.
Sorry.
I think that's really important, actually, because there is that issue with, and we've all read them, you get into a book partway through and then suddenly you find yourself reading about the geography of it for 3 pages. And one of the biggest pieces of value a map can bring to any book is just that ability to go, here's a picture, it's worth at least 1,000 words of these pages you're going to read. We can just name check it, as Adrian was saying, and then give you a bit of an idea of where it is, and that's fine, because you've taken in more than you think you have when you've looked at it, and you don't then have to wade through what can often be quite dry, weirdly, it always feels like it's expositional prose, I think, once you hit too much of it, and I think they're just fantastic for that. But
and on the other hand, there are certainly books that don't need map. I mean, the kind of the multi-volume fantasy epic, I think, is you know, like if you're sort of Erickson or Martin, that kind of scale, the map can be really useful, just purely because those books are going to cover thousands of pages and go to dozens and dozens of different places and countries and fiefdoms and political districts and whatever. And as a sheer, okay, that was a weird thing that just popped up. As a sheer physical reference work, the map can be really useful. But for example, Spiderlight didn't have a map because it's a linear quest. It is very much riffing off the idea of the traditional fantasy quest. So you are going from A to B to C to D, and eventually at the end of that line, there is the Dark Tower. And there's no point having a map for that, even though the characters are talking about maps and talking about the geography, because you always know where you're going next. And to a certain extent, it is literally the journey and not the geography that is important. So the map wouldn't really serve that kind of purpose. So I guess it's a book by book.
Tom's maps are works of art, as opposed they look like maps, but you definitely could not navigate that world using his map. And if you sit with how I describe the journeys in the book with that map and try and put it on that map, ain't gonna work. And that is all my fault, not Tom's, because I sat there for a long time with the first draft trying to work out speeds of ship and how far you could get and how long it would take. And that is very complicated. So if you read closely the bonus ships or any of the series, you'll see that they travel for an amount of time in a certain distance, and it's all very non-specific. Because it just doesn't matter to the story that we tell in the end. It's not important. So this map's a pretty thing in the front that gives you a feel for the world, but it's not actually useful.
I love it when maps lie.
Yeah.
One of my kind of treasured possessions that I don't have anymore is the D&D game Dragonlance did a thing called Tasselhoff's Map Pack. And I was very excited to get my hands on it because they'd previously done proper, almost like, ordnance survey style, put on your wall poster maps. But this one was just bollocks. It was a collection of, and they were all beautiful, but there was a collection of stuff that he'd scrolled down. So it was like, here's where the kitchen is in this castle, and the kitchen's huge, and then everything else, because he's not been there, is irrelevant, sort of thing. And it was full of these little pointless maps. And I do like
very much like Castle Hoff Barefoot.
Yeah.
Horrible. I really don't like Kenda. I could take that hoopak and stuff it where the sun doesn't shine. Sorry, maps.
No, it brings me on to actually another question, which is there a bit of, when you're creating a fantasy world, is there a bit that you sit there and you go, I suppose I'm going to have to put the Kenda in. I suppose I'm going to have to deal with the ecology. I'm going to have to, there is a thing that I have to address because it makes sense to the story, but I don't want to. What's the bit, what's the equivalent of doing the dishes when it comes to world building?
Working out distance and length of travel for your ships. But I didn't do it, so I don't do boring things. I get rid of them.
If you'd been a gamer, that would have been easy because you already know, what walking pace is, what rough terrain is. You missed out there, aren't you?
Well, the thing about a ship in a fantasy book traditionally is it's like a spaceship in a science fiction book. In it, people get on it and then they travel and get off it, and that's as much as the story needs.
It's like fast travel in an MMO.
Yeah, it is. That's the whole reason for it. It's like they went on a journey and then they were at the next city where the story actually happens. But I set my entire book on the bit where they're moving around through the sea, which is not as easy as it sounds. I suddenly think I need to fill up all this time that they're doing stuff for. So maybe that was kind of quite difficult in a nuts and bolts way, finding things to fill all the slack time that isn't, and get over that idea of there being slack time on a ship as well, without being too boring. Though I did actually, there are places in the book where I actually wanted the reader to be thinking, oh, for God's sake, will you just get on with it? Because that feels into it.
Robin Hobb did ships in her live ship.
Yeah.
Which are, really amazing. But I think her other half, I may be wrong, is a mariner. So
the whole family are, yeah.
Oh, right, there you go then. There you go. So I suppose that's cheating then, really.
But that's why I was glad she liked it. Because I said, because if she didn't, and I was like, oh no, I got ships wrong for Robin Hobb.
I'm reminded of the GMS quote about the speed of a Star Fury, which is it goes as quickly as the plot demands.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that in Star Trek as well as what speed various warp levels really indicate, and whether it would, because at different estimates it would take the Enterprise many human generations to get from A to B, or alternatively they would do it so quickly that most of the plots wouldn't need to have happened.
Warp speed is just an indicator of how important it is they get to a place. Or get away from a place.
I got a 5-page email from a reader of the Shadows of the Apt series explaining to me in enormous and mathematically backed up detail why my airships were too slow. And they were right. They were absolutely right. But yet, I mean, I have the same, I have time and distance blindness, basically. So I now just hand wave as much as I possibly can. And then I got pulled up for that in Children of Ruin by the editor saying, look, you're gathering.
Oh, we've lost you, Adrian.
Yeah, no, he's vanished. He'll probably pop back again shortly. We are coming towards the end. We are starting to run out of time. But I was going to ask another stupid question because unfortunately the audience can't ask questions because they're in Saturday and we're in Monday, which is a problem. But there we go. What I was going to ask is, as writers, who do you think is the master of world building, and who would you? And who would you like to be able to, you know, follow in the footsteps of, and who would you like but don't necessarily want to be the same as?
Tolkien has to be the grandmaster of world building. I mean, all the languages, all the cultures, wouldn't want to be him in any way, but one has to admire that depth. But I think maybe stories came from the background and the world building rather than the other way around. But it is incredibly immersive. I suppose Martin has also got a very well realized world on a much smaller scale. They're very good at what they do, and I applaud them. I would never wish to do that myself.
Matthew?
Oh, my turn. I will come at Tolkien thing from another point of view. I love everything that he does with it. I think a lot of the end result at the end of his world building, it's, you know, 80 odd years old, a lot of it, and it shows in a lot of places, and certainly sort of, hello again, Andrew.
All right, Adrian.
How the sort of the end result shows its age, but I think the actual techniques in building the worlds are absolutely fantastic and are just as relevant now. It's just maybe show a little bit less of it, particularly the poetry at the far end. In terms of someone who I think does a fantastic job, this is science fiction rather than fantasy, is Timothy Zahn, who's got a whole series of standalone or quite short series of books. And again and again and again, he just knocks it out of the park, creating a world that I actually believe is livable. I've not read any of his his fantasy stuff, but a little bit of the sort of present day fantasy, set in places I've never been, like New York City. I believe all of that, even the slightly weird things he does with it. And then when we're talking about sort of research stations in the gaseous atmosphere of Jupiter, or strange time-lost colonies where everyone is a cyborg assassin and things like that, it's just fantastic. And that's definitely very much from the school of, he's got a very particular scientific gimmick he wants to investigate, I think, and then it all folds out from there. But I could never do that because I don't have patience with the science. But what he builds on that is just absolutely fantastic.
I've said about what Adrian does with evolution, which I find very impressive. But probably the reason I write and the thing that sort of lit up my imagination completely, and I just thought this is properly amazing, is Ian M. Banks' culture world, which is just this. It felt, has always felt so real. And one of the reasons I became a writer was because I thought maybe I'll meet Ian M. Banks one day. I know I was too late, so I should have worked harder. But I just find it, the whole of it amazes me. Every sort of little detail that it folds in itself, but it's not the world really, because sorry Matthew, but Tolkien does nothing for me. It leaves me really cold, because what I love about Ian M. Banks is the heart of it, which is it is about people, or humans, trying to do the right thing, and that is what draws me into a book. I don't particularly care about worlds, which is a dangerous thing for a fantasy writer to say, but it's not what I'm thinking about. I mean, I'll spot it if the logic doesn't fit together, then it throws you out, and so it all has to work. But if it's working, I think the thing is, for me, you don't notice it.
Yeah,
you're just in another world, and you're not thinking about it. It's just there. So that if I'm thinking,
sorry, Ajay.
No, you carry on. I'm just wishing.
No, it's when you're writing a book, it's like a record. You know, back in the day, I still have a record player and I still listen to vinyl. But it's anything that bounces the needle is jarring, and you kind of want to get rid of that. You need to keep the penny on the back of the stylus. And world building is just a part of that whole thing. So if it's dodgy, it's like one what's that film? Reign of Dragons, something like that. Where one minute they're in London and the next minute they're in Edinburgh. I can't remember. It's a really shocking film from the 90s. Reign of Fire.
Yeah,
Reign
I
of Fire.
remember that.
Christian Bale.
That's the Badger. Yeah, and it's shocking. One minute they're here, the next minute they're there. And the premise is, it could be really good fun, but it's like, it jars you thinking, well, that's just stupid. And all the time you're thinking, well, that's just stupid. That's really annoying. You're not concentrating on the story and the characters. And the same goes for world building in books. If something jumps out of you, like, well, that's flipping silly. Oh, that was hard. Then you're not concentrating on the story. So it's kind of all got to be, keep the record smooth and not jump you out of the groove. So it is important if it's a secondary world situation. So much easier if you're writing, urban fantasy or something. But yeah, that's the thought.
Going back to the core question, which was authors that inspire you to build worlds.
Sorry, Ed.
Sorry, because Adrian wasn't there when I asked the question, which was.
Well, can I just bounce off something that KT's just said? Because from my perspective, I would say I would find urban fantasy much harder for exactly that reason, because you've got so much pre-built that you've got to work around. You've got to have whatever your fantastical element of your urban fantasy is, and then fit it into the real world in such a way that the real world still makes any kind of sense. Whereas if you've got a secondary world, I mean, I avoid the sort of, hopefully I try and avoid the sort of issues you're describing, purely because I do start with the world and everything comes out of it. So once my world has developed, I say, well, right, where are the friction points? What plot, what sort of struggle is inherent in the world I've created? What sort of characters arise out of the societies that I've set up? And therefore, hopefully everything is speaking the same language in that world. Everything gels together. Whereas if you're trying to put a fantastical element into any form of the real world, you've got to account for how that fantastical element hasn't derailed the real world in about 45 BC.
So writing the real world in itself is I'm writing crime novels for my own amusement and hopefully profit at some point. But you can't just cheat. You can't just have a ghost turn up and kill someone, or a dragon destroy everything so your heroes can get out of jail. There are rules, and everybody knows the rules. You can't break.
There's a game where people ignore it because it's so far from the norm. What's the thing? What's the thing where, not the paradox? There's it might be Vampire the Masquerade or Magician. That game, and basically if anything horrifically weird happens, normal humans just kind of ignore it because it's so far beyond you're putting a strain on the universe by doing so. But that's the get out that I believe a lot of people use. It's that if something, a vampire leaps on somebody in a nightclub, normal humans think it's just a goth, or don't even register it, and just carry on because it's just too weird. So I don't know. I think sometimes urban fantasy, they do get it easier because you can just say you picked up his cell, you got in a cab. You're not saying he got on the weird animal that walks with its 8 legs and then flies a little bit. And I think they do have a little easier sometimes.
I'm reminded of a book that's out at the moment. It came out about 6 months ago called The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle.
Stuart Turner. Yeah.
Which is a murder mystery, but he keeps getting murdered again and again and again. It's Groundhog Day, but harsh. And apparently he got someone to sit and line read all the way through, so he wouldn't get any emails. Basically, once it came out, he kind of redid it because he'd made his life incredibly hard for himself.
I've talked to Stuart about that book. And I think he practically had a nervous breakdown getting it all right. When you speak, it's just like, what did I do? In my books, seaward and landward instead of left and right. When I did the first version, at some point I inverted them, and it took me weeks of going through this book and getting them all right before I actually realised that no one but me knows which is left and which is right, and no one would ever know. Fool.
So,
But I know it's right now.
if this was if we were in a convention space right now, there'd be a lovely person, probably in some sort of uniform, making this sound and trying to end the slot. So unfortunately, we're about to run out of time, even though, what is time these days? Gone a bit weird. So can I have summing up statements, and also this is the last chance for you to plug your current novels.
Who's starting? The organisers, Ed.
Do you want to start with Katie?
Summing up, yeah, world building has its place. I don't think it takes the place of story. I think they're the kind of books that leave me a little cold. Although I do admire the grandfathers who have come before and created the genre. Basically, no Tolkien, possibly not fantasy in the world in the way it is now. It would have evolved very differently, I think. I do have a book. It's called From Hell's Heart. It is not a Shakespearean quote. It is actually Herman Melville. And yes, it's doing very well. I have the best fans in the world. They're all way funnier than I am. And so far, none of them have pulled me about world building, but I did get pulled by a medieval scholar once about the use of the word salmagundi. And I got an essay on that.
Matt?
I think world building is hugely important, but I think the one thing that really comes out of this conversation is that how you engage with it is always going to be different for you. And if you're not having fun with it, you're probably doing it the wrong way. There isn't a right or wrong way, as long as the results speak for themselves at the end. Whether you're doing my horrible traditional Tolkienist way or starting with a big idea and working backwards from there, you've got to do what suits you. And yeah, so my book Legacy of Ash, out in paperback now. It uses a little bit from column A and column B from that. There's big ideas, but there's a lot of world building hiding in the background. Hopefully it's not as obtrusive as maybe I've made it sound, but I'm sure people will tell me.
From the reviews, they've been astounding reviews.
They've been very kind, a lot of them, certainly.
Yeah.
It's always edifying. It's been quite nerve-wracking, particularly because we've ended up with the double release on it, with the hardback last year and the paperback this year. So there's a whole new wave of people coming in, and most of them are still saying nice things, which is wonderful.
Brilliant. Oh, is it me? World building. It's what Matt said. Enjoy yourself. That if you're not enjoying writing, then why do it? Because it's very hard, and not as hard as working in a call center, that I would say, to be honest with you. But because on your head, I never want to go back and work in a call center ever again. If you're enjoying it, it's probably going to work. And if your way of enjoying it is to do what Matt does and create a massive world where you know everything that's going on, then that is absolutely fantastic, because that is your thing. And if your way is to do what I do, which is to skip through it, making it up on the go so your story works, then do that, because both of these things can work, and your way might be somewhere in between, and no one can tell you how to do it. Only you know what's right for you. And my book is The Bone Ships, and I did loads and loads of work on the world of this, and I created a massive, if you're into world building, I created a massive world, and it actually took me 8 years, I think. And if you're not into world building, then I just made it up as I went along. But yeah, you can choose which of those is most likely.
And all I'd add to all of that is that world building and universe building is what sci-fi and fantasy do that goes beyond other genres. It is the strength of the sort of stuff we write. So that's why I write sci-fi and fantasy, because I can make worlds. And for books, Firewalker's out in May, Duels of Eden out now in August, having been knocked back a bit by the usual.
Oh, can I add one thing that I don't think we've said and actually think is a proper, important, serious point? For world building, the important thing is that your people live in that world. They're not people from our world in a fantasy world. Because that's what makes it work. That's what makes it real, is that they're reacting in the way they would react in that world. Unless you've imported them from our world, of course, then ignore that. But the people of that world live in it, and what is normal to them is not what is normal to us. So they don't react like us. They react like the people of that world, that's probably the thing I'm most careful about when I'm writing, I think.
And on that note, we're going to have to end it. So again, it's weird because normally I would like ask for a round of applause. So if you're on Twitch, if you want to write the word applause, I suppose, then write the word applause. Thank you everyone for coming along. These are interesting times we're in right now. And it's also been absolutely lovely to see you all as well, because normally I would have actually been able to see you at the bar and drink and say hello and all the rest of it. But instead you get to see my front room, which is nice.
It's just nice.